Should he stay or should he go? That seems to be the question surrounding Anthony Santander this offseason. Try to answer it, or at least give you the take from both sides. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to take a look back at Anthony Santander's 2024 season and try and predict what could and what should happen with him this offseason. I'll give you the case for re-signing Anthony Santander, give you the case against re-signing Anthony Santander, and then give you my thoughts on what the Orioles should truly do. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So it is really the biggest question surrounding the Orioles this offseason in terms of one single player. Even you could argue more than Corbin Burnes, because although Corbin Burnes is the big ticket item and another ace in Blake Snell is already off the market, he signed with the Dodgers. If the O's don't bring back Corbin Burnes, it's something that we figured would happen all season anyway. I actually feel a little more positive at this point than I did 3 months ago that the O's will re-sign Corbin Burnes. But even if they don't, there are other options. There's Max Fried, there's other pitchers they could fill in around him. And the O's could fill in the outfield if they don't re-sign Anthony Santander, but he's more the fabric of this team, right? He's been here forever. He's a big part, big cog in the middle of their lineup, just had a huge season, career high 44 home runs. That decision may be the number one decision of this Orioles offseason. And so it's not black and white. Like for Corbin Burnes, it is the Orioles would love to have Corbin Burnes back. It is the question of how much money will they offer him, and will he take that offer and come back to Baltimore? With Santander, it's a lot more nuanced as well, and that's why I think it is the number one big question of the offseason. So I wanted to start by taking the approach of this is why the Orioles should bring back Anthony Santander and should re-sign him to a contract this offseason. The first point there is this is a productive middle-of-the-order bat who is going to be super, super tough to replace. He's coming off a career year, 129 WRC plus. The only season he's been better was in the shortened season when he only played 37 games back in 2020. Career high 44 home runs, 235 average was the lowest of his career, but a 308 on base and a 506 slugging really kind of saved him on the year. It was an 8.7% walk rate, a 19.4% strikeout rate for Anthony Santander this year. 44 home runs, and he's averaging 35 home runs per season the last 3 years. Only 5 players in baseball have more home runs than Anthony Santander over the last 3 years. Santander has a combined 105 from 2022 to 24. Only 5 big leaguers have more home runs. That is how good Santander has been. And again, the stuff under the hood still looks good. 11.7% barrel rate is great. That was the best of his career. That was in the 79th percentile of baseball. His 114.4 mile per hour maximum exit velocity, that was the hardest ball he has ever hit in his career. That was in the 93rd percentile of baseball. That came this year. Those are great numbers. I mean, seemingly he's still getting better at things. And he is older, but he's not old. I mean, he just turned 30 in October, just over a month ago. Like, he's still got good baseball years ahead of him. Like, this should be a guy you were excited to bring back into your lineup. And he pulls fly balls at a high level, and data shows that pulling fly balls consistently helps you do the most damage as a hitter. And that is something Anthony Santander, whether it's from the left or right side, does really well. That's another great thing about Santander. He's not even as a switch hitter in his 30s at a point where he is platoon heavy. He had a 132 WRC plus as a left-handed hitter and a 123 WRC plus as a right-handed hitter. Now, generally throughout his career, he's been a little bit better from the left side, but those are still very productive numbers from the right side of the plate as well. And you got to think with the Orioles now moving the left field wall in a bit, he should be able to slug a little bit more. Like, he has always slugged much better from the left side. Maybe that can even out a little bit when it's easier to now hit a home run as a right-handed hitter at Oriole Park. Maybe that makes it a little more enticing for Santander to come back. And another nice thing is, like, even though he's very power-centric with his 44 home runs, he doesn't do it exactly like a lot of other guys in the Orioles lineup. And with the O's struggling down the stretch offensively and only scoring one run in the 2 games being swept out of the wild card series, a lot of what we talked about after that in this offseason has been, what happened to this amazing, vaunted Orioles offense down the stretch? Are they too reliant on the home run? Are there too many guys who are long ball or strikeout in that lineup? And yes, Anthony Santander is very reliant on the home run. There is no arguing that, but he doesn't pair it with a super high strikeout rate. Like, in the last 3 years combined, he has a 51.5% fly ball rate. That is 4th highest in baseball. Only 3 hitters the last 3 years are hitting more fly balls than Anthony Santander. He is clearly hunting home runs, but he's not striking out a crazy amount. Like, his 3-year strikeout rate is 20.5%. That's on the low end of the league. The 19.4% this year was the 4th lowest strikeout rate on the Orioles. Like, he's a guy who you're banking on not striking out, and you feel comfortable he is going to put the ball in play. That's kind of a nice part about Santander, despite the fact that, he is hunting a home run every single time he goes up there. And his walk rate is not amazing at 8.7%, but it's better than league average. And it was the best and highest walk rate of his career. So he's getting better with the pitch selection and the batter's eye as well to go along with the home runs. These are really, really good trends for Santander. You look under the hood, and really the only concerning number is his chase rate. It was 33.8%. That is, he is swinging at 33.8% of pitches outside the strike zone. Generally, it's well, for most hitters, it's hard to hit home runs on balls outside the strike zone, but Santander will hit home runs on balls outside the strike zone. We've seen him do it plenty, and that's the great thing. Like, Santander is such a good bad ball hitter. He hits balls that are outside the zone better than almost anyone, that it's okay that, his chase rate is in the 16th percentile in baseball, right? It's pretty high. But here's the thing. His chase rate is actually lower this year than it was in 2023. And right around 33% is basically what it's been, if not higher, for most of his career. So he's been productive for his whole career with that chase rate. That's just who he is. It's not something that's spiking. Sometimes when guys get older, their chase rate starts to spike. They start swinging more and more outside the strike zone. And it's, a sign of a little bit of their downfall. This has always been Santander. It's not really a bad sign or an issue for him. And that's all the offensive stuff. There's also the clubhouse stuff. He's a very well-liked guy in that room in Baltimore. Not only do the fans love Anthony Santander, but the Orioles players and coaches love Anthony Santander, it seems, in that room. And to be honest with you, I personally still trust him enough defensively in right field. There are worries that, he's not going to be an outfielder anymore. He's going to be a DH only or a first baseman. I'm still okay playing him in right field at Oriole Park. Like, it was a -2 outs above average this season. So he's basically rated out as a little bit below average as an outfield defender. There's a lot of players that play the outfield a lot that are like that. Now, he's not super fast. He doesn't move the most gracefully. But, I've heard someone say this, and I've repeated it again and again on the podcast, like, Anthony Santander uses exactly as much energy as he needs to run down a fly ball to get to a baseball in the outfield. And he does that consistently throughout his game. And you know what? He's getting to enough balls to hold his own defensively in right field. He's got a great throwing arm. I think he's better than people expect out there. And I'd be fine with him for a couple more years patrolling right field defensively. When you add it to everything he brings on the offensive end, it's just a guy in the middle of this order who, again, is going to be tough to replace. Like, people talk about, you can throw Heston Kjerstad in there, put Kobe Mayo in right field. You can throw Dylan Beavers out there in right. Are they going to give you 44 homers and a 130 WRC plus like that in their first big league season or their first couple of full big league seasons? I don't think so. Like, it's going to take a while to fully replace what Santander has done for you for years now. We're talking about a 3-year stretch of a 122, 119, 129 WRC plus, and he has stayed healthy. You're like worried about, his body's going to break down. He's done an amazing job of taking care of his body. He's played 150 plus games in each of the last 3 seasons. This is all coming together for me looking at it and saying, you know what? Yeah, it's going to cost a little bit. Like he's a good hitter. He's going to get paid, but the Orioles, it seems like, need his bat in the middle of their lineup. I don't know if they're going to find someone who can replace what he gives to the O's. Certainly a lot of great things that he gives to Baltimore, but there are some detractors. There are some reasons why you maybe wouldn't want to bring Santander back. And we'll give you the argument from that side coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks, well, they filter out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, you can't sift through baseball tickets for a while, but basketball, football, hockey, get all the tickets at Game Time. They've got amazing all-in pricing. You turn on this feature, you don't get any surprise fees at checkout. That is a great part of getting tickets at Game Time. And hey, maybe you're not watching sports, not going to sporting events in the offseason. That's fine too. Game Time Picks and the curation they have, well, they make it easier to save more on not just sports, but also concerts, comedy, theater, and more. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So I just gave you the reasoning for bringing back Anthony Santander as he hits free agency this offseason. Now on the flip side, we go to the argument for not bringing Anthony Santander back. And I think the first part of that argument is, if there's something the Orioles possess, it is young outfielders who can mash. Even with Kyle Stowers being traded away at the deadline last year, Heston Kjerstad is right there and could step in and play right field most days for the Orioles. His bat seems to come around. Hopefully he's healthy with that concussion, and he's getting better and better defensively out there every day. And he's been waiting to get that chance. A healthy Kjerstad could produce. Steamer projections at FanGraphs have him for a 111 WRC+. Now, that's short of what Santander gave you this year, but guys can always overstep projections. And what we've seen from the Orioles the last few years, projections are generally light on young teams, and they're generally light on young players and rookies. So if there's a guy more likely to outproduce his projections, it is a player like Kjerstad, who has yet to play a full big league season and have all that data for the projection models, especially a guy who's dealt with health issues and injuries where you just haven't been able to get as much data on him for his numbers moving forward. And Kjerstad could certainly quickly get to that production that Santander gives you. And then you have Judd Fabian and Dylan Beavers waiting in the wings in AAA, and you even have Enrique Bradfield Jr. waiting in the wings and Vance Honeycutt below that to play center field and move some other guys to the corners. Like, the Orioles have outfielders in this system where they can backfill, obviously for much, much cheaper. Even with David Rubenstein at the helm, you're still going to look to save money in places so you can spend it elsewhere. And even, like, you can play Ryan O'Hearn. Like, the Orioles picked up his $8 million team option for 2025. He's played outfield here and there the last 2 years. He's not the greatest out there, but he's athletic enough to continue to do it. You could mix him in there with the younger guys to get his bat even easier into the Oriole lineup. Maybe this is your opening to try Kobe Mayo in right field to make sure he has a more regular spot in the lineup and find a defensive position that works for him. But you could also end up adding a right-handed hitting outfield bat, which you know the Orioles either way are trying to go after this offseason. Now, if they bring back Santander, maybe they're not doing that, but you could bring in that bat that could play some right field and could be a cheaper platoon guy like a Randall Grichuk, who has crushed the Orioles for years. He has crushed lefties. He can still play the outfield. He can hit really all around. He's a good hitter. His matrix projection is only for a 1-year, $5 million deal this offseason. He'd be cheap. You could bring him in, platoon him with Heston Kjerstad, and feel good about your right field production next season in a lineup that at times felt like it needed Anthony Santander, but does it really with all the talent they have for that kind of price that he might be asking for? And that's the thing. Like, the free agent matrix is projecting Santander for a 5-year, $100 million deal this offseason. Now, there are questions surrounding if a team will actually pay him that. The reporting so far is that teams don't want to shell out 6 figures for Santander, but that's what he's asking for right now. I don't think the Orioles want to promise him 6 figures either. I don't think the Orioles want to promise him 5 years on that kind of deal. And at that point, if you do go 5 years, he's going to be 35 years old And sooner rather than later could be clogging up DH because, again, he looks okay out there in right field, but who knows, as he gets slower and slower, can you really consistently play him defensively in the outfield? Does he become a first base / DH kind of guy? And if he continues to hit 40-plus homers, then that's fine to be a DH. But if he drops down closer to his usual level, like a 30-home run guy, well, it's tougher for that to be an everyday DH if he's still, hitting around 240 with 30 homers. Is that really an everyday designated hitter for that kind of money? I'm not sure that is cutting it. I think in the Orioles' perfect world, Samuel Basallo comes up and in 2026 and beyond, he's your DH when he's not catching because he's so good offensively. You don't want big time guys on your roster who are DH onlys when you get to that point with Basallo. And he's been healthy, as I mentioned, 152 plus games each of the last 3 seasons. He's done a great job in the offseason, kind of overhauling his work to keep his body in shape, but he's now into his 30s. Those things, as you get older, start to work less and less. Does his body, he was very injury prone early in his career with different injuries throughout his time. Does his body start to break down again as he gets into his 30s? It is, I think, a very fair question to ask. And even if he stays healthy and stays spry enough to stay in right field for most of his contract, can this approach that he has at the plate really hold up? Because I mentioned he hits a lot of fly balls. He is certainly, again, no argument, trying to hit a home run every single time he comes to the plate. But that has its drawbacks. Santander had a 54.8% fly ball rate. That is the percentage of balls he put in play that were fly balls, 54.8%. That was the highest in Major League Baseball among qualified hitters this season. Nobody was hitting more fly balls this year than Anthony Santander. And it worked out for him. He hit 44 of them over the fence for home runs, and a lot of them at key times. But what that fly ball rate also does is it leads to low BABIPs. It leads to low batting average. He had a career low 235 this year. And it leads to a lot of infield pop-ups. And that is something that if you dig a little deeper, you're like, well, he was striking out less than 20% of the time. That is a very low strikeout rate for the kind of hitter he is. But when you dig just a little bit deeper, you find these infield pop-ups. Now, while he only struck out 19.4% of the time, 16.7% of his fly balls were infield pop-ups. Infield pop-ups as a whole are included in fly balls, but his infield fly ball rate of 16.7%, that was the 8th highest infield pop-up rate in baseball. So although he's hitting a lot of fly balls, he's hitting a lot of them into easy, uncompetitive outs. 43 total infield pop-ups for Santander this year. That is 6.5% of his total plate appearances ended in an infield pop-up. When you really think about it, now this is not 1-to-1 as a comparison, but 99 out of 100 times, maybe more often, an infield pop-up is basically the same result as a strikeout. Rarely, unless a team basically makes an error. You have that tiny sliver of a chance that a team could drop a pop-up and make an error. But otherwise, pop-ups aren't allowing runners to advance. They aren't getting guys over. They aren't getting guys in. Pop-ups, again, 99 times out of 100 are just as bad as a strikeout in any spot, but especially in a key spot. So if you add that 6.5% infield pop-up rate to his strikeout rate, you get a strikeout plus pop-up rate of 25.9%. And so if you're calling infield pop-ups basically the same as strikeouts, 25.9%, that puts him into the top 30 of the highest strikeout rates in baseball this year. That changes things. And now, again, you're not including everybody else's infield pop-up rate, so it probably wouldn't be in the top 30. But he's not coming up with anything more often than you would think because of all the infield pop-ups that he's hitting. And as he ages, for, again, 99% of players, that power is going to start to dip a little bit as you age. Does more of his fly balls turn into pop-ups as his body starts to age? That's something you do have to be concerned about if you are going to give out a 3, 4, 5-year big money contract to a guy like Anthony Santander. So those are the two sides of the argument. So coming up next, I'll give you my thoughts. Take a little bit from each. Talk about what I think the Orioles should do with Santander in free agency this offseason. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So I've given you both sides of the argument for and the argument against the Orioles re-signing Anthony Santander this offseason. With all that data, here's where I fall in on the decision. Frankly, I don't think anyone is going to give him that projected 5 years, $100+ million. When you look at the free agent market, the way it operates, corner outfield bats who are not great defensively generally don't do super well in free agency. You have to be a generational bat to get big time money when you are past 30, you're a corner outfielder, and you're not great defensively. Now, if Santander is going to hit 40 home runs every season, maybe he deserves that, but he's only done that once. He's more of a 30 homer guy. I just don't see him being the kind of guy that gets $100+ million. Now, could he turn out to be Nelson Cruz and just continue to play like this throughout his 30s? Yeah, that's a possibility. It could be Nelson Cruz 2.0, and the Orioles didn't bring him back after his big year, and his career just went on from there. But he could also be a guy who starts to decline in his 30s. And if you give him 4 or 5+ years with big time money, you start to regret that not soon after giving him that contract. So what I look at is if that deal can come down to 3 years instead of 5 years, even if the cost is more like $25 million per year, right? 5 years, $100 million is $20 per year. Even if it's more like a 3 years, $70 million, 3 years, $75 million deal, that's where I'm more comfortable if I'm the Orioles. And David Rubenstein being in charge really changes that. It makes me much more comfortable giving out 3 years, $75 million. John Angelos absolutely would not have done a contract like that. But Rubenstein has the money where if it really doesn't work out in the 3 years, he can get the Orioles, basically spend the Orioles out of that, like we've seen some other big market teams do. And again, if it's $20 to $25 million a year for 3 years, I would pay that to get Santander back on this team. It is not easy to replace production like he has in the middle of your lineup. We've talked about it. And especially a guy in Santander who can go on heaters like he does. That is what he is famous for, the Santander heater, where he hits homers and doubles and can carry a team for a 2 or 3 week stretch. He's done it plenty of times throughout his career, but he had some of his biggest heaters in 2024, which is why he had such a great season. 13 home runs in the month of June. It was absurd what he did in June. If you combine June and July, that 2-month stretch this year for Santander, he hit 282 with 22 homers and a 172 WRC plus in that stretch. At times, he was the Orioles offense in there. You really want to give that up with that kind of production and the special kind of hitter that he can be in your lineup? And obviously, there comes a point and a price and years where the Orioles may back out. If it gets to 5 years, if it gets over $100 million, the Orioles may back out. And maybe a team like the Nationals or a team like the Tigers, who are seeing themselves in the upswing and desperately need some sort of power bat in the middle of their lineup, but are not going to shell out for a P. Alonso type or a Juan Soto, maybe turn to someone like Anthony Santander, who they think could be a little bit cheaper, a little more under the radar, but they can overpay him a bit, pay him the 5 years or pay him the 6 figures, get him to DC, get him to Detroit, place him in the middle of his lineup, and see if they can take the next step in 2025 and beyond. That's certainly a possibility here. And for the Orioles, you are certainly weighing, hey, do they think he can stick in right field? I don't know if they do long term. Do they think this offensive approach can keep it up? I'm not sure if they do long term. But again, if you can get in that sweet spot of a 3-year deal, and maybe that means you have to pay him $25 million a year just to get him to accept less years for more money. But you have David Rubenstein now who can make those kind of deals and not have it completely blow your budget, not have it completely kill your team if that 3-year deal, $75 million, doesn't work out perfectly in those 3 seasons for Santander and for the Orioles. It's not going to destroy you at this point. I think it is worth it to get him back. And again, this is something that we have to kind of reassess our thoughts on free agency going from John Angelos to David Rubenstein. The Orioles now have the money and the means and the support to play at the top of the market. As I mentioned, Blake Snell signed with the Dodgers. The Orioles are one of the 4 finalists in on Blake Snell. Dodgers, Yankees, Red Sox, Orioles were the final 4 reported teams in on Blake Snell. That is not something we could have said for the last decade or so on these free agents. The Orioles are playing in a different realm now with David Rubenstein. And it also means they can take more risks. Something we've talked about on this podcast a lot. You'll hear a lot. It can sometimes be hard for these teams like the Orioles who have done this full rebuild, and they've done the dollars per WAR, and they've done everything through analytics, and they've crunched the numbers on every single decision and put a value on everything they do, and it's worked out for them, right? They've turned this franchise around to now be a winner. We haven't seen it in the postseason, but they are a winning World Series contender right now. But they need to continue adding to this team to try and get that ring that we all want to see come back to Baltimore for the first time since 1983. And to do that, you have to overpay, because if you are just looking at a dollars per WAR perspective, pretty much any big time free agent who signs for, let's say, 3 years or more, which I think Santander is going to get 3 years or more from pretty much any team he signs with this offseason, you overpay. No matter what kind of dollars per WAR metric breakdown you do as this kind of data-driven team, you overpay to get free agents because you're not paying for what's going to happen in the future. That's what you're projecting numbers-wise. But in free agency, you have to pay for what they've done in the past. You have to pay for the player who just hit 44 home runs and dragged this offense at times because he was just so red hot when the Orioles were struggling. That's what you have to pay for to get players in free agency. Maybe Blake Snell wasn't worth 5 years, $182 million. But the Dodgers had to pay that to know they could get him, and they felt okay doing it. That is what the Orioles have to feel okay with. No matter what Mike Elias's numbers say, and I get it, right, about the projections, you are not paying for projections. The whole point of free agency, rewarding players for their past performance. That is what we have free agency for. And if the Orioles aren't willing to give him a little more money, and I understand not wanting to give him 5 years, but if you're not willing to go past $20 million a year, someone's going to give him $25 million a year. A bigger spender, a more loose, less data-driven team is going to do it. And you might say, oh, that team, they weren't going to like that in year 3 or 4. But guess what? You're also not going to have Anthony Santander next year. And there are players that can do a better job of backfilling him. If you don't get Santander and instead you give that money to Teoscar Hernandez, I'm probably okay with that because it's a very similar, you could argue a little bit better hitter who can produce right back in the middle of your lineup. Maybe that's okay. But those are the only 2 players that fit the Orioles need. They're in that level of hitter. It's Hernandez and Santander. So if you don't get Santander, you kind of got to get Teoscar Hernandez. And there's a lot of teams in on him, including the Dodgers. Then you don't get him. Then you're looking at a different 2025 Orioles lineup that has a hole in it that could be filled by just, you got to overpay a little bit. That's free agency. You pretty much, if you're going to get a big time free agent, you have to overpay. Might have to do it for Burns, might have to do it for Santander, whomever. This is going to be that test for the Orioles. If they really want Santander, they're going to have to pay a little bit more. And nobody knows what Santander is worth right now and moving forward than the Orioles do. That's the only team he's been with in the major leagues. But even knowing that, they're going to have to get past that to be true players in free agency. We've heard all the talk about spending the money, and I think they're going to do it, but we haven't seen the move yet. To have that move happen for a multi-year deal with Mike Elias has not yet given out as Orioles GM. To give out multi-year deals, you have to overpay more than your model says a player is worth. That can be hard for teams like this to get over. The O's have to get over that hump. I think Anthony Santander is a perfect player to make that jump with this offseason. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know your thoughts on the Santander situation. What you'd be willing to pay him. Do you think the O's should bring him back or not? Should they look elsewhere in the outfield? Let me know in the comments. Again, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Also, wherever you listen, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave a rating and a review. That really helps out the pod. We'll be back tomorrow, maybe wrapping up some Orioles news and notes, any signings that might come across the board. Hey, we're less than a week away from the winter meetings. Get you set for that as well on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.